In ancient India, there existed a type of force which was called Āṭavī Bala. Āṭavī means forest dwellers and Bala is force. So it literally means force of forest dwellers. Now, before we talk about this force, I think it is important to first talk about the forest dwellers. So what we see is that when we read ancient Indian literature, we should first keep in mind that what we know about these forest dwellers has not come from these forest dwellers themselves. The literature that was written on these forest dwellers was written by people who lived in villages and cities. So this should be kept in mind. Having said that, we see that in ancient literature, multiple terms have been used for forest dwellers. And of these multiple terms, three terms are quite important. So the first term is Vanachara, second is Aranyavasin, and the third is Āṭavika. So when we talk about these three terms, we see that in Kautilya's Arthashastra, these three terms appear. But what is interesting is that these three terms have different meanings attached to them. So these three terms are used for forest dwellers, but the meaning and the role associated with these terms are quite different. So what we see is that terms like Vanachara and Aranyavasin has been used to describe people who live in forest and those who move about in the forest area. But the term Āṭavik has been used in a slightly different sense. What we see is that the term Āṭavik has been used in Kautilya's Arthashastra particularly to denote those forest people who had some connection with the state. So what we see is that in one sense, Kautilya uses the term Āṭavik to suggest that these forest people were in opposition to the state's authority, and in other sense we see that this term Āṭavik has been used to suggest that these forest people were employed by the state. So when we look at the employment part, we see that according to Kautilya there existed four forests of elephants. So Kautilya tells us that in order to guard these forests, Āṭavikas should be employed. Then we have the important term Āṭavī Bala, which means forces of forest dwellers. So here we see that these forest people were used by the state as a type of force. Now what is interesting in Kautilya's Arthashastra is that Kautilya talks about 6 types of forces, and in these 6 types Āṭavī Bala is also mentioned. But Kautilya places the Āṭavī Bala at the bottom of the list, and the reason behind this has to do with their unreliability. Kautilya tells us that these Āṭavī forces are prone to looting, and that is why a king should always be careful when to deploy these Āṭavī forces. Although Kautilya says this, but the fact that he includes these Āṭavī soldiers in the list of different forces suggests that it was impossible to ignore these politically active forest dwellers. Now what is interesting about the ancient period and even up to the early modern period is that in most area forests were present. So it was impossible for a ruler to ignore the people who lived in the forest, and we see that many trade routes passed through forest, and there were traders and merchants who were constantly moving through the forest. So it was quite important for a particular ruler to see that these merchants and traders are safe in the forest. Another source of danger for the ruler was that these forests could also be used as a place of shelter for hostile enemies. So because of all these dangers, Kautilya recommends that a ruler should deploy some troops in the forest. Kautilya talks about Vanadurg, which means forts in the forest. Now these were not forts in the traditional sense of the term, but from these areas, these Vanadurgs, troops could always ensure what type of activities that were going on in a particular forest, and they could also provide security to the traders and the merchants that used to pass through a forest. So from this reading of Kautilya's Arthashastra, it appears that there was this belief that forest dwellers were a source of danger. But there was also the belief that these forest dwellers could be tamed and their power could be used in the service of the state. So there was this dichotomy that was going on, particularly in Kautilya's Arthashastra. Now, if you want to know more about ancient military history, you can watch this playlist. Thank you for watching.